All right, we're there. Thank you so much for coming to our panel. We are going to start. Folks are getting their food are welcome to keep getting your food and mill on back, but we are going to begin our program because the beginning part is always the most boring part. Speaking of which, welcome to our lunchtime plenary about the links between transportation and housing. My old friend, the late Justin Burry, said once that transportation and housing, they're like this. And so that's the whole panel. Thanks. Have a good lunch. No. We have with us 4 terrific speakers from around the country to discuss the many ways that transportation and housing are similar and different, and the ways that advocating for and sometimes against parts of those policies are similar and different. I am Michael Andersen with Sightline Institute. I am very pleased to introduce, in order, Alex Baca is the DC Policy Director for Greater Washington. She previously worked at the Coalition for Smarter Growth and ran Cleveland's bike sharing system, and she's also frequently published on these issues. Next to her, Alex Contreras was born and raised in Downey, California. They founded the Happy City Coalition that successfully stalled a planned freeway expansion. The Happy City Coalition is now focused on building an anti-racist network of advocates in and around Downey to answer a simple question: what makes our cities happy places to live? Amy Stelly is the co-founder of the Claiborne Avenue Alliance, a coalition dedicated to the restoration of the Claiborne Corridor in the Treme and 7th Ward in New Orleans. She also edits opinions for The Lens, a nonprofit newsroom in her hometown, New Orleans. And at the end, Jarrett Walker is an international consultant in public transit planning. His clients include transit authorities, cities, developers, nonprofits. Jarrett's worked on more than 200 public transit projects in 100 cities of every size. The way this panel is going to work is that we are each going to take turns. Well, our speakers are each going to take turns talking for about 5 minutes, no slides, about what they're about, and then we're going to have a bit long Q&A. It's going to be awesome. We will start in the order I introduced, yes, which is down the table, and Alex is going to kick us off. Please. Join me.
Hello, this is working. Okay, great. Hi, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. You already know my name. I'm Alex Baca. I work for Greater Washington in Washington, D.C. I serve as the D.C. Policy Director. We work on land use, housing, and transportation. Many people are familiar with our website, Greater Washington, the blog, ggwash.org. We have a policy side. I lead that work in the district. We are part of the DC region, which includes DC, Maryland, and Virginia, and counties within that. So the prompt for this panel was kind of amusing to me, because if you're here to talk about housing, you are also here to talk about transportation, because what we're actually talking about is land use. I think our land use patterns in the United States govern more directly, yet more invisibly, than nearly any specific intentional policy. I think that is not news to people here. We have lower densities, we have greater distances in the US, and those are encoded into where things are. It is honest that we reflect social segregation in the actual spaces in which we live. I am quite a fan of landscape architect and planner Sonia Hurt. Her book, Zoned in the USA, is required reading for anyone here. She calls this a distinct spatial culture of individualism, and sort of her assertion is that this was founded on the ideal of separate single-family residences apart from the dirt and turmoil of industrial and agricultural production. That's not the output of our municipal regulation, but it's the ideology from which those regulations are derived. That's where we start as a country. Again, this shouldn't be super surprising, but I guess it is perhaps news to some people that transportation is a piece of this. I don't know how valid that is for your own experience, but I know for mine, those two things have always been integrated. I've been in this space for over a decade, and I've worked on both housing and transportation for so long that it's kind of an anathema to think that anyone could think about one without thinking about the other. I know that many others in this space, including my co-panelists, are very, very skilled weavers of housing and transportation policy. I don't think that that's particularly radical. I just think it's quite pragmatic. But it is possible that we might be hurtling toward a movement of pro-housing rhetoric that doesn't consider the realities of how people move between places. It is important to me that what I do desegregates racially and economically exclusive spaces, and I'm not sure that it is possible to do that through housing production alone. We need transportation to connect the dots of housing. I have a couple of other thoughts about this, specifically in the context of the DC region that I think are better suited to questions. So I'm just gonna turn it over to my counterpart.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Michael, for the introduction. My name is Contreras, and I am locally grown, born, and raised in Downey, California. Back in 2020, I learned about a proposed freeway expansion that would impact my neighborhood. Oh,
If you're comfortable.
I also have an autoimmune condition, so which is why I feel more comfortable wearing my mask.
You can do it if you want. That's fine.
Okay, in that case, I'm gonna put it back on.
Great.
So, is that better? Can everyone hear me?
That's great.
Okay, awesome. I want to make sure that you guys are able to hear me. But yeah, so my real first fight with freeway and housing transportation began in 2020 when I learned about a proposed freeway expansion that would bulldoze hundreds of homes in my hometown of Downey, California, along with cutting through a park that I grew up playing in called Dennis the Menace, and it would cut through my elementary school that I attended, Unsworth Elementary. And what I learned that year was that Caltrans and Metro Los Angeles were going to begin acquiescing homes starting in 2025, yet no one in my neighborhood or my community had heard so much as a whisper from either the state or regional transportation authorities. And so that began my long campaign talking about housing and transit and how if we're going to work in making sure that people stay in their homes, as well as make sure that there are homes available to them, as well as provide much more mobility, much more access and a variety of means of mobility for them to move through, we had to talk about housing and transit together. And so I co-founded the Happy City Coalition in 2021 with a bunch of other advocates in and around Downey, so we could talk about housing and transportation from an anti-racist lens. Because if we continue to make the same mistakes that we've been doing for the past 50, 60 years in our land use and transportation policies, we're gonna be doomed to repeat them and continue to leave marginalized communities out, especially mothers of color who depend so much on transit and are forced into terrible transit situations and terrible housing situations as well because they're not given much of an option. So I'm here to talk to you guys a little bit about how do we talk about housing and transportation from an anti-racist lens, and how do we work on undoing decades of housing and transit policy that have predominantly affected Black and Latino communities here in this country. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, my name is Amy Stelly, and I'm born and raised in New Orleans. And I actually live in a corridor, a neighborhood that was impacted by the Claiborne Expressway, and it's I-10's little dip down south into New Orleans. There are other ways to get across the city without actually taking I-10. New Orleans, for those of you who haven't been there, is a very compact city. You can get anywhere in the city within 15 minutes. It is very, very small, geographically small. So we don't really need a highway, right? You can go through the city without actually being on the highway quite comfortably. Since Katrina, the quality of transit in New Orleans has really, really declined. At one time, we had robust transit. So even though I lived in a corridor that had a highway, we also had transit, which kept people from going on the highway. But these days, transit, riding the bus, has become a bad word. So folks in New Orleans think now, some of them, that if you ride the bus, then you're poor, you're less than. Unfortunately, that isn't good for people who are forced to ride the bus because they are stigmatized, particularly women of color, who are being pushed out more and more. The folks who have Section 8 vouchers, they're being pushed more and more out into the suburbs where the transit between that housing stock and the city is really, really bad. So we are in an unfortunate position of having folks go to a place for affordable housing where they can't get back to the job center. So it's critical in New Orleans that we understand that the two have to be married, and that transit is not a bad word. Truthfully, I kind of stumbled into transportation planning. It is not where I started. I started off as an architect and urban designer, but always wanted the Claiborne Expressway gone because I lived with it and currently live with the ills of it, which are really, really bad, especially in a city like New Orleans. We have prostitution, a lot of crime. I live near a ramp, a lot of drug dealings. So these highways are detrimental to neighborhoods. So just continually talking about the ills of the highway and the need for it to be removed from not only my neighborhood but other neighborhoods of color has really put freeway fighting into the spotlight. And I never thought in all my years that it would be a glamorous thing to do. It's a very tough thing to do, but a necessary thing to do, because neighborhoods that are impacted the most are black, brown, and poor neighborhoods, because we have little value in the eyes of some municipalities, but also in the eyes of the banking industry, because this is how we got there. So these highways traditionally are put through red line neighborhoods. So you have displacement because the banking and political community feels that those neighborhoods have no value. So now more than ever, it is very important for transportation advocates and housing advocates to work together. And fortunately in New Orleans, we're beginning to realize that. You know, we've had housing advocates call Claiborne a corridor of opportunity, which means they're looking at big development, which is not necessarily the best for the neighborhood. So now hopefully we can get on the same page and look at incremental development that is compatible, particularly with historic districts. I live in a historic district. The building stock is very, very unique. So we can't just say, well, leave the highway, put more buses, build whatever. It doesn't really work that way. So we have to learn to work hand in hand. Those of us who fight for better neighborhoods, and those of us who fight for housing, and those of us who fight for better transit, we've all got to get on the same page, or cities will not function. And in many cases, like in New Orleans, they'll be ruined because we have so much to lose with bad decisions there. We can't cover them up. We don't physically have the space to do something bad and then, you know, put bushes in front of it. It doesn't quite work that way. So with that, I'm going to pass the torch because I think we'll get into a lot more conversation with the Q&A.
It's been great just hearing these three stories and the kinds of things that these three women and many other people out there are doing in their communities to build more affordable communities and to heal much of the racist legacy of our current infrastructure. You know, what is infrastructure? Infrastructure is a way of making your grandchildren live by your values even after you're gone. You know, we all live inside of the infrastructure that our grandparents built for us with the best of intentions, and here we are, and that's part of the normal generational cycle, I think. So one of the things to have in the back of our minds is the hope that we leave better infrastructure for our grandchildren than they left for us. Look, affordable housing that a low-income person can't get to is not affordable housing. And so
That's right.
So you all have to care about transportation. You know, to riff off of that famous quotation, you may not be interested in transportation, but transportation is interested in you. or another way I've sometimes put it, land use planning and transportation planning are the same thing described in different languages. And unfortunately, they really are different languages. So we have plenty of examples. When I go from city to city, and my job is mostly to help cities think about their city bus systems, and I'm constantly encountering affordable housing. Oh yes, we're building these apartments way out on the prairie because they'll be affordable. You know, we're building these apartments way out of town and they'll be affordable. Don't get me started about shelters for the unhoused, which are inevitably, you know, in an industrial park, in a ditch, next to the landfill. All in places that it really doesn't make any sense to run a bus to, and we normally would not run a bus there, but now we have this need out there, and so we have to drive a bus out there that will be largely empty. And then people will see the empty bus and say, see, transit, bus transit, nobody cares about that. Right? See the game? Now in the decades, in the last couple of days, really the 90s and the aughts, we went through a period where we got excited about the new urbanism. And it was an important movement, and it really created a lot of the framework for why people even think density is possible now. And inevitably, that was a process of getting wealthy and influential people interested. And to do that, we built a certain amount of charismatic density associated with charismatic transit. And so we have things like the Portland streetcar, lovely thing, I encourage you to go ride it, lovely experience, associated with intense developments like the Pearl District, lovely place, encourage you to experience it, you probably can't afford to live there. And so we have that linkage between the charismatic density, the charismatic transit, which is fine, you have to put that out there. Fortunate and affluent people need to be able to see that in a way that makes sense to them. But now what we need is a lot less charisma and a lot more scale. If transit, as in housing, if it doesn't scale, it doesn't matter. And so we need to be focused now, and I need to encourage you to be focused on the kind of transit that scales. Now at the other end of the spectrum, we have another kind of charismatic transit out there, which is the idea that we'll all ride around in little vans or cars with 2 or 3 people on them. Maybe they'll be driverless, who knows. But that is also an incredible way to move a few people incredibly inefficiently at a very high cost per rider. And remember, inefficiency always turns into inequality. Inefficiency means we make something scarce, and we make something scarce, most people can't have it. So we have to pull back from both of those extremes, both of those kinds of charismatic transit that were being sold, and come back to the good old fixed route city bus, which nobody cares about. Well, some of you care about it. I've devoted my life to it. But boy, when I'm sitting down in meetings of important people around the country, you know, as soon as the door's closed and they think nobody's recording, boy, the things I hear them say about fixed route buses and the people who ride them. We have to combat that. Now, fortunately, I can tell you from my experience that you don't need to change the culture around fixed route bus service. If fixed route bus service is useful, people use it. And while a lot of people want to talk about changing the culture, and that's okay, I'm not saying you shouldn't, I know that I personally don't know how to change anyone's culture, but I do know how to change their situation. And in changing people's situation, in presenting them with fixed route bus services that are useful, abundant enough that they're there when they're needed, and yes, clean and decent, not luxurious, but clean and decent, finding that line, we can do incredible things. And a good example, you know, for those of you who are used to thinking about transit, I will say, don't just envy Europe, start by envying Canada. Because in Canada, you'll find very similar looking cities with very similar looking geographies and very similar economic history, but there's just a whole lot more buses running around. There's just a whole lot more buses running around, and as a result, a whole lot of other good things are happening in terms of access to opportunity, in terms of climate, and so on. The transit isn't any sexier. There's just lots of it. So I want to end by just making a little pitch for a project I'm going to be working on here, and that if you live in Portland, if you live in the Portland area, you're about to find out about it. I'll be working with TriMet on a very exciting project to help the region visualize where it's going with bus services in the next 5 years or so. So pretty near term, have an impact. In a few months, we're going to be out to the community with some contrasting alternatives of different directions the bus service might go. One thing I know you'll find when you look at those maps is that there's not enough service, and that very difficult trade-offs are having to be made because there just isn't very much to work with. So that's your cue. You are going to have to help us think about those hard trade-offs, and we need everyone and everyone you know to be paying attention. That's called Forward Together. It'll come along soon. But also be aware, the only reason we have to make these hard trade-offs is because of decisions we've made historically about how unimportant city bus service is. Those are always decisions we can make differently. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody. I'm going to start Q&A with a question for each of you. The general rules for the Q&A is you do not have to answer every question. In fact, you can pass, and the audience may even clap for that if you do. But you should also absolutely jump in on one another. If you have a question, I would love to get back and forth and crosstalk. It is fantastic when people disagree. So please feel free to disagree at every opportunity you see fit. With that said, I know everybody's going to be polite to each other and conscious of everyone else's needs and habits. So my first question, what was your personal path to transportation reform? And did you get to it before or after you started thinking about housing reform? Each of you has dipped into this a bit. If you would like to expand on that, I would love to hear it. Start with Alex.
So I feel very lucky to just have been in a world that I was able to think about both. My first job out of college was working for the Alt Weekly in Washington, D.C. I come to this work out of an interest more so in local government and politics than anything else. It's just that I find housing, transportation, and land use the most interesting facets of the application of local government and politics. So I've done a lot. I've worked for a bike advocacy organization. I've worked for a kind of old school smart growth organization. I've run a bike share system. I work now for an org where I sort of see my responsibility as moving us beyond some of those norms established by new urbanism and smart growth. New urbanism is infatuated with design, and I think smart growth is a little bit averse to politics. So, it's cool for me to apply what I know. Like I said, I work in DC. I work super locally. GG Wash has said in the past that it's a regional organization. I fear that we've misled some people, though I look forward to our expansion into meaningful work in Maryland and Virginia in the future. But in DC, we're able to, and through my work, I really try to link this to politics. I work intensely on the budget and oversight that comes before the DC Council. I also work closely with the administration. We have 2 branches of government. It's important for me to utilize the power inherent in each of those bodies. So a lot of this for me comes from just like this. DC is my home. I grew up in Maryland. I consider DC my home. I love it there. I will participate in the political process. I think voting is the #1 place where people engage, not at public meetings, not on listservs, but they vote, and we need more people to vote, even in high turnout democratic cities like DC. So for me, my path into this was I was lucky to work on things that I liked and enjoyed. I was ready, I didn't want to perpetuate the place where I grew up, which is very affluent, very white, very exclusive, and it had some very, I think, severe effects on the people who live there. And I view this as an opportunity to move this to a next step where we can talk about housing off of corridors. We can talk about undoing some of these existing land use patterns that aren't really working well for people at all. But a lot of that comes because, I love local politics, so.
Right.
I kind of want to build off what you said, local land uses kind of being everywhere. So like I said, I grew up in Downey, California, and it's very much a suburban city within southeast LA County. And I grew up on the north side of the 5 freeway within walking distance from it. And in my neighborhood, there are no sidewalks. And I know that sounds crazy. Some people look at me like there are no sidewalks. There are no sidewalks. If I want to walk to the corner store, which is not really a corner store as much as it is a liquor store, I got to walk in the middle of the street. And I was taught by my parents, walk in the middle of the street, not the side, so that way the cars can see you when you're walking. And they'll slow down, hopefully. I nearly got run over a few times. But that's neither here nor there. And so I was one of those people who just grew up in LA County sprawl. And I never thought things could change because it's everywhere. Other neighborhoods with no sidewalks, buses that come once an hour, nothing but single family homes, maybe apartments here or there. And I think my first sort of, when I look back on growing up, going to Cal State Long Beach, I attended Cal State Long Beach, and I would take the bus from Downey to Cal State Long Beach my freshman year because I didn't have a car. My parents both had cars, but I did not, and I did not have a job that would provide for a car payment, let alone have a job that would provide for me to live near Cal State Long Beach. And it's so funny because I would complain about how shitty the transit service was all the time, and I would complain about how expensive the housing was by the university, by Cal State Long Beach, but I never quite made the connection until way later on when I just became more involved in housing. And I realized, oh wait, but if we build nothing but sprawl and there's nothing but cars and we don't take, retake that land to now be used for the common good as opposed to just simple car infrastructure, then nothing is ever going to change. And I also realized like growing up in Downey, it's hard to change people's minds. It's hard to show them that something is better when they've never actually experienced it. So making these decisions to put in bike lanes, to put in bus lanes, to deviate away from car infrastructure as the norm to providing more alternative modes of transportation for people who cannot drive, for people who do not want to drive, for people who like to bike, for people who like to walk, is going to take a lot of local politics efforts and local coalition building with our neighbors, because if people sometimes don't know what's out there. So that's why when I founded the Happy City Coalition with a bunch of other advocates in and around Downey, we wanted to ask people, what makes a happy city for you? Like, if you could wake up tomorrow and things suddenly changed, what does that look like for you? And depending on where you are, the answers vary, and it allows you to see where people are in their understanding of how local politics, as well as housing policies and transportation policies that were established decades ago affect us today, and help steer people towards, well, things can be better, things can change. Here's how we can do that. And so, yeah, that's basically a bit about how I missed the dots for the longest time. Even in college, I missed the dots, and it wasn't until very recently when I was like, oh, wait, they're the same, they're different sides of the same coin.
Amy.
Well, I kind of stumbled into both. I became known in New Orleans for going up against the mayor by writing an open letter to him saying, don't do stuff in my neighborhood, or what you've done is a waste of money. It started with me being an advocate for the improvement of a local recreation center. The city had spent $3 million, and the pool, the natatorium, was just full of mildew. So I really became known for my voice. Although when I first came back to New Orleans in 2012, I spent some years away. I was interviewed when this housing was imploded next to the highway and said, I-10 is going to be the next thing, and everybody was like, she's a nut, just don't even listen to her. But I kept talking so much that eventually housing advocates sought me out in our fight against short-term rentals, which is really real in New Orleans, because short-term rentals is taking all of the what was affordable housing,
Testing.
pushing the
I'm like
service
whispering through a
workers
mask,
that
so
make
probably a
New
little
Orleans
lower.
run
but you
into
can
New
hear it.
Orleans East, where they don't have transportation.
Good to hand this over to
So
people
I
who have
actually
questions.
started working on both in really odd sort of ways. I think the housing advocates at the time weren't thinking, we're going to put transportation and housing together. They were thinking, she's got a big mouth, and if she keeps talking, then the politicians will listen. And actually, it worked for them. But I have spoken to housing advocates who don't connect the two. And when I've gone to them and said, your land use decision is not good for the neighborhood, or these two things aren't working together, I've heard, go away, bye. We just want the big box, which isn't the solution for everything. Lately, however, I think some of the housing advocates have realized that without the transportation piece, they're not going to be successful. And this is a real recent development in New Orleans, I have to say. So fortunately, the Claiborne Avenue Alliance just had a really huge community meeting because we want to get behind reconnecting communities and actually take the interstate down, which will give us a lot of available land. Highways take a lot of land, especially the ramps. So if you look at places like the 7th Ward in New Orleans, and tomorrow when we talk about highways and housing, I'm going to show some of those slides, you'll see how much land has just gone to waste with highways. So we have to work together in the city, because once that land is released, it does need to become affordable housing. The land that the highway gobbled up was the land where musicians lived, where craftsmen lived, you know, the bricklayers, the masons, the finished carpenters. All of those people were moved out for the highway. We need those tradesmen, those people who make the city work. They need to come back. The issue we're going to have is making those neighborhoods desirable again, because one thing failed transportation does is it makes neighborhoods undesirable. But there are people who see that neighborhoods near downtown, like Treme, like the 7th Ward, like many other neighborhoods that are close to downtowns in metropolitan areas, they become valuable again, and then we have other issues with gentrification. So it's a big ball of wax. We have to unpack it one piece at a time. But it's important that we understand that we can't have one without the other. We need both of them to make cities work. So I guess I've kind of stumbled into both, even though I've studied both, wanted to participate in both. Being in a position where they were both married is relatively new to me, because now I have to talk about them together as opposed to separately. So I'm hoping that we can all, as advocates, have the conversation where transportation and housing are married. They definitely matter. The thing that I'm happiest about, which is unfortunate, is that the increase in oil prices is going to force people to look at transit differently. So it's a good outcome in a way of a really horrible situation in Europe, but I'm now hearing people who can't afford to fill up their gas tanks think about transit. And I'm thinking, all right, I don't like the way we got there, but maybe they'll have a renewed sense of how valuable transit is. If you're just a regular guy who owns a truck, an old beater truck, and it's costing you $150 to fill it up every week, transit becomes really, really attractive, especially if you were relying on that old truck to bring you in from the suburbs to the city. Now that old truck is no longer reliable. So those folks have two choices. They can move from the suburbs into the city, where it's no longer affordable. New Orleans is not an affordable city, right? Or they can live in the suburbs where it is more affordable and take transit in. So folks are now having to make a decision. And New Orleans is so compact that it doesn't take long to travel anywhere. So our job as advocates now is to make people see that there's value in both, right? We need the affordable housing. We need good affordable housing, not affordable housing that's affordable in name only, and then you go in and it's trash. I've gone in some affordable housing where the mechanical has been up front and really ugly in front of people's door, inside of the buildings, and that's not, it's cheaper, but it's not great. So we've got to have folks understand, particularly developers and public officials, because in New Orleans, the public officials get it wrong. Affordable housing doesn't mean it's less than. It is not less than, it's just not as expensive, but it needs to be as good. So there's a lot of work to do in both areas to actually make cities work, but I think we're at a position in our history where we can do that. It takes work, you know, we just have to keep talking. That's what I heard not long ago, keep talking, which isn't hard for me.
We should
But
move.
it takes time to convince everybody. I'm going to pass the torch.
Thanks.
That's great. My answer to your question isn't nearly as interesting because I've been a public transit geek since I was 9 years old.
That's also legitimate. Thank you. We've got another 25 minutes to do questions, so I'm going to, in that spirit, ask you each to answer in 30 seconds or less. What is the story of somebody who was really upset about your transportation work? Tell me about that person. Starting on the other side with Jarrett, moving back.
30 seconds?
30 seconds.
I revise bus networks for a living. I move people's bus stops. People are furious with me all the time.
There's nothing angrier than your personal bus stop. That's the. that's the-
I will tell you, I
Testing,
once, long
testing,
ago, did a
testing.
complete redesign of the Corvallis bus system, improved a lot of people's ability to get places, and the entire journalism coverage was about angry people at a senior citizen's home who were out there picketing because I had moved their bus stop around the corner to a different side of their building.
That's
Awesome.
interesting.
Amy.
30 seconds. I guess my story, my success story, is the transition of a lady, or transformation is a better word, of a lady named Merlene. So Merlene is a neighborhood resident who's in the cultural community. She's a baby doll, and that's a whole thing, a whole nother discussion in New Orleans. And she was filmed a year ago talking about my work as the worst thing in the world. She will never agree with it. And at our community meeting last week, she suddenly changed. She transformed, and her opinion about highway removal and what it means for neighborhoods, particularly her neighborhood, she owns more than one property in the neighborhood, is great. So I was very happy to hear that Merlene had gone from hating the work that I do to at least considering it with a much more positive attitude. So that was good.
All right, that was the success story question I didn't even tell you about yet, but that is a perfect thing, so that was right on. Thank you so much. Alex.
One of the people who was angriest the most at my work with the Happy City Coalition was the former highway director at Metro LA, Director Ansari, who is now no longer the highway director of Metro LA, which is probably my greatest achievement. I have been campaigning for his removal for like 2.5 years, because if we're going to change the way transit works, we need to put in people who are advocates for people-first mobility, not car-first mobility. So yeah, that is probably the person who's the angriest at the most in my work, who is no longer with Metro.
Well-earned anger. Awesome. Alex.
I'm starting my clock. I'm used to public testimony. The person who is angriest at me is myself, because when I started my job in 2019, I was so excited to just be the housing program organizer for the first time in my life. I was so excited to have one job. And then in like a week, I was like, nah, I'm still doing transportation policy. Our council needed a lot of work on Vision Zero. We jumped in on that, and that happened. So, you know, I've reconciled with myself, and my org has raised more money, and I have a better salary and a better title now. But I was pretty pissed at myself.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to shift over to coalition conversations. So one thing that Jarrett said once, I remembered, is that public transportation, the quality of public transportation, depends on people who do not ride public transportation, because the median voter doesn't ride public transportation. Therefore, we need opportunistic coalitions in transportation as in housing to make progress on this. I wonder, my question for each of you, and I'll start with Alex C. this time and move to Amy and around, is how do you see those coalitions changing in your lifetime, both past and future? I would love to get your thoughts.
That's a good question. So we start our work with a very simple question: what makes a happy city for you? And we also want to make sure that the question is asked through a lens of an anti-racist lens. So that way you're examining not just what's happening today, but what today happened. And I don't think we're doing enough of that today, to be honest. I don't hear a lot of people talking about housing or transit from an anti-racist lens, from a people-first mobility concept. because COVID has left millions of Americans disabled and will leave millions of Americans more disabled. And what are we going to do when we don't have housing or transit policies that are going to accommodate them and make sure that they are able to live their best lives? So that is something that I'm very concerned about today, that I don't hear a lot of people in housing or transit talking about, because it's not just about the infrastructure, it's about how can we make sure that people achieve their full potential through the housing and transportation options that are available to them. And when you begin to break that down from an anti-racist and people-first mobility concept, what does it look like to be disabled and move through the world? The conversations broaden, more people are brought in, and having that space also allows for more grace and forgiveness of ourselves and for each other, so that way we can move forward together, because we can't move forward separately, we have to move forward together, which means that more people have to sit down and have these conversations together, as well as center these communities. I think one thing that is not being done enough by housing orgs present at this conference, this is something
Please.
I was a little hesitant to say, but I think it's something that needs to be said. We need to center communities of color, lower income communities that are at the front of this housing crisis. It's not being done enough. It's not being done in transit. It's not being done in housing. And it's time for people to sit down and step back and listen. So that's what I'm imploring everyone here to do today, to sit down, step back and listen, and also make room for graciousness for yourself and for others.
Thank you so much. Could you expand on that a little bit? What's an example of a way that the centering can happen?
So there's a couple ways that you can go about this. One would be if you don't think that there are voices in the room talking about that, I'm just gonna gently point out that there are plenty of voices talking about that, you just haven't heard them, or you just haven't been listening. I think online spaces, as well as within housing spaces, can be a bit of a bubble, and sometimes you have to break out of that. How do you break out of that? That's a challenge upon itself. Finding places that focus on finding organizations that work through an anti-racist lens work, finding organizations that focus on disability and people mobility first. If those conversations are not happening in your circle, then I would suggest finding people who have been having those conversations for a very long time. Because disabled advocates have been talking about transit for decades. No, but it's not our fault if people haven't, it's not their fault that people haven't been listening. And so yeah, I think that's one of the first steps. There are plenty of organizations out there that are already doing the work. Just make time to listen and look for them.
Yeah, the disability parallel is interesting. Yeah. Amy, thoughts on coalition and opportunistic coalitions with people who don't agree?
Well, coalitions can be silos. That's one thing I've noticed. So the housing people do housing, and the transit people do transit, and the preservationists do preservation. One thing that we have to do as advocates is be nimble. And you not only have to listen to other groups, you have to participate with them. So more often than not, folks will look at a person like me and say, well, why is she talking to the preservationists? Well, preservation has to do with housing and transit, or why is she talking to the housing person? That came up at our community meeting. Why is she there? She shouldn't be there. Yes, she should be there. She's got all of the data we need about housing to inform us about other things. So you've got to be willing to talk to people who don't look like you and who don't think like you and who don't frequent the same places necessarily. So if you are only one type of advocate, that you get involved or go to a meeting with other types of advocates. I also participate with environmentalists, and they're all tied together. We're hearing that now, but you shouldn't think that an advocate is all over the map because they're talking to all different types of people. For my work with Claiborne, I realized that I couldn't do it without preservationists. I can't do it without environmentalists. I can't do it without folks who are transit advocates. I can't do it without even the political community, who listens least, I have to say. They listen the least of which is damaging because they make the laws. It's dangerous. Scary.
That is annoying.
But we do have to talk to everyone. That's really the only true way to build a coalition.
Jarrett.
It's my job to go into lots of cities and help them think through changes in their bus system, almost always in the context of having very little money for bus service, and almost always in the context of not having enough money to meet the needs that should be met. And so we're always making these kinds of heart versus lung trade-offs in terms of what we're going to do with this pittance of budget. And I'm not always popular in those jobs because as the guy who has to say this is how much money there is, people assume that I'm saying that I think there should be only that much money. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding of that. But what I do is something very important in the context of this conversation. I have been, as somebody who's been working on transit for 20 years, it's incredible what the racial equity agenda has brought to this topic and how completely it's changed the conversation for the better. And that's so exciting. And and it is my place often to come to people who care about racial equity, just as I come to the business community, just as I come to the seniors, just as I come to everyone else and say, I don't have a cultural role here, I'm not part of your community, but there's some math here that we have to live with, and we have to solve some problems inside of some math and some physics that none of us is able to change, right? And the process of watching and I'll be honest, when I put it later this year, when we put out some contrasting alternatives for the bus network for Portland, those alternatives are going to divide this room. People in this room who are allies are going to have different reactions to those maps. And so it's very challenging because I not only bring people together, but advocacy communities often accuse me of dividing them because, yeah, I have to present these choices and not everyone's going to respond the same way. But it's been incredibly gratifying when it works. When I think about what we did in Houston or in Dallas or in San Jose, where we have been able to get through to a decision that not everybody liked, but that the leaders understood, that the stakeholders understood, and that people could at least explain. Well, it's what we can do in my terrible job, which is unfortunately to ask people to solve problems in these contexts.
Bring people together with broken dreams. Got it. Cool. Alex, finish this off, then we'll take a few from the audience.
Okay. So I don't view my job as building coalitions. I view my job as building a constituency. And a coalition may be a method by which you do that, but ultimately my goal is to get elected officials to realize that they are elected by voters who want more transportation, fewer single occupancy vehicle trips, more integrated neighborhoods, more desegregated neighborhoods, more affordable housing, more access, more opportunity. They want growth and they want redistribution. So that's my job. We have that constituency in DC. I know it. Do elected officials feel like they have a mandate from it? Not quite, but we've made some serious inroads in that in the past few years. Juju watches the C4, we make endorsements. I could not do my job without politics. I brought that up for a reason. So one of the things that absolutely infuriates me is when I talk to an elected official and they say, well, I need some riders to tell me that they need more bus service and that we should fund this thing. Like, how dismissive is that? Does anybody in here want the bus to come less frequently? Right. I learned a lot from Jarrett, who I've seen present in a couple different cities, and his work has really informed the way that I speak about this in what I do, and I'm grateful for that. And I've sort of stopped acquiescing to that tokenizing of bringing people down to the Wilson building, which is our city hall, trotting them out and saying, here you go, here's your ideal rider. Talk and say that you want more funding for transit. In my conversations now with council members, with the administration, with their staff, and with other advocacy groups, because advocates in DC and probably in other cities are sort of this like rank of people that sometimes it's advocates, parentheses, pejorative, or advocates, parentheses, we love them. That's a separate conversation. But I've started being more direct and saying, why do you need to ask riders? Nobody wants the bus to come less frequently. What justification do you need for that? Let's have a more sophisticated conversation about this. This is hard. At the point where you actually engage in a transit planning project, there are a lot of trade-offs. People are gonna be unhappy. There will be things that people will lose. It's not an easy process. I'm really, really proud that the district funds our Housing Production Trust Fund at over $400 billion a year, and that we have just put over $50 million into planning dedicated bus projects. So that's all gonna be coming online in the next few years. I think that Gigi Wash was a part of that, but even more so was the sense that voters want this. And I'm out to build that constituency more than I'm out to build coalitions. Although I do want to recognize that my organization runs 2 excellent coalitions that my coworkers have to do a lot of work to lead and reconcile, and it's really, really challenging. Running a coalition often precludes you from doing the work because the work is running the coalition. So at the time that you need to do that and that's a useful tool, you should, but I tend to think about this more in terms of, what mandate do we give our decision makers? How do we make them feel it? Rather than, how do we unite diverse voices around a table when everybody honestly has a lot of work to do. I want to be respectful of people's time, so I'll stop talking.
Message the median voter, maybe not so bad. Okay, cool. At least in DC. I will take 2 from the audience. We have 9 more minutes in this session, and then I want to do one more lightning round. I think we've got time for 2. Feel free to target somebody. Feel free to raise your hand, and I will tell your question back to you for the live streamers. Or I'm happy to keep talking.
Keep talking.
All right. Oh, Jim's going. Or sorry, Ted.
So this is sort of a Jarrett Walker question, but I'm as curious what the other 3 have to say. In Portland we have neighborhoods. We've managed a lot of great things with neighborhoods in Portland, but neighborhoods are kind of holding us back in a lot of respects. I won't go into details, but the types of transformational change that we need are system level change. And so many Portlanders, like in a lot of cities, are just sort of framed as their neighborhood. So how do we talk to people in the neighborhoods and build these coalitions you were talking about that get that system level change? An example I would use would be the faux bus rapid transit that we got on Division. It's not really a bus rapid transit, but if we could have gotten that, we would have unlocked an amazing amount of housing in greater community districts for the urban core. So throw that out there.
Question is, we have big structural changes to make. When we concentrate decision-making at the local level, it's hard to get people on board. How do we help local decision makers in a neighborhood association, et cetera, think about the big picture? Who wants it?
I'll start. Neighborhoods are peculiar things. They have their own identities, and we want that because that's what makes them different. I think you have to really speak to each neighborhood in particular about the big picture. People have a hard time seeing the big picture. That's one thing that I've learned. So you have to go to each neighborhood, it's a lot of work, and tell them how they fit, because one size may not fit all, but you have to be consistent in your messaging and tell each neighborhood how they fit in and why this is great for them. You still have to cater to those individuals, if I can call it that.
Here's what I would, I froze up for a moment when you asked that question because it's one of the hardest questions out there. So Division, let's start with Division Street, 20 miles long, runs through probably 20 neighborhoods that are very different from each other. The bus cannot get bigger or smaller, change colors, or do other things to fit better into the neighborhood as it goes down that street. And the functionality of that service, the reality of whether people get to their jobs and whether they can hold their jobs, will depend on the total travel time down the line, which is going to depend on how it gets through each individual neighborhood. Each neighborhood does not get to design that thing for themselves. That's not how it works. And this is why we need appropriately empowered city and regional planning that is capable of having a productive dialogue with the neighborhoods, recognizing, though, that not everything, a good transit system does not just bubble up from the initiatives of a lot of neighborhoods and is inevitably going to be in conflict with some of them. We do one more thing. When they're working with neighborhoods, I will draw everyone a picture of here's how this plan changes where you can get to from your neighborhood in your city in a reasonable amount of time. Because we're in the business of providing freedom. And I can map that freedom, I can quantify that freedom for every neighborhood. And then people who value that can sit across the table from their own neighbor who wants nothing to change on their street and who wants to keep their parking space, and let them work it out inside their neighborhood. But that, of course, means you have to have neighborhood associations that really speak for their neighborhoods. And you have to have that real convening happening at the neighborhood scale. And that's a great challenge for all of us.
Alex C?
I'm going to tackle this more from an organizing standpoint, using a real-life example around some freeway legislation that we're trying to pass in the state of California. If you live in the state of California, listen up, because this applies to you. AB 1788 is a anti-freeway expansion bill. And so part of my volunteer work is organizing organizations to get behind anti-freeway expansion. Now, obviously, not all neighborhoods, not all cities, not all regions within the state of California are going to agree on how we can get this done. And part of organizing is also part of managing people's egos and managing egos of neighborhoods and cities and where they come from in that sort of standpoint. So from an organizing standpoint, in terms of unifying people, I helped found the Destruction for Nada Coalition, which is a very simple organizing concept. No more freeway and road expansions. That's it. You can be a X amount of organization here, X amount of organization there, that might not necessarily see eye to eye, housing versus housing, transit versus transit, but we're all united by this one similar concept. Anti-freeway expansions, anti-road expansions, for ABC reasons. One, they predominantly affect low-income communities of color. They're monuments to planned institutional racism that exists today. Three, freeway expansions are bad because emit more greenhouse gases. That's disastrous for the planet and everybody involved. But from an organizing standpoint, not all these organizations see eye to eye on how we should get A, B, C, or D done. But in terms of unifying them separately, sort of outside of that, their individual space, come together as a neutral coalition moving forward around this one concept, much easier to get that work done. And much easier to bring folks to the table, so that way we could put a large amount of support behind a certain bill. And I'm going to plug this in real quick because I'm an organizer at heart. I know you all have phones, so I want you guys to go to Happy City Coalition. We're on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. We all have links to, so today is actually the deadline for you to submit your letter of support for 1778 in the Transportation Committee. We really want to see this passed. So if you want to be an active participant in stopping freeway expansions in the state of California, go to Happy City Coalition, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, find the links that we have put up, send in your letter of support to stop freeway expansion 1778 to the Transportation Committee, and you could do it right now, and you could probably do it by the time I finish talking. So,
Praxis, right here at EMB Town. Alex.
So I think Alex sort of spoke to this. This isn't going to be a satisfying answer to your question about a project that seems pretty heartbreaking, but my goal is to change the rules. GG Wash has sort of shifted its advocacy over the past few years from project by project, sort of individual engagement, getting people to show up for stuff. I think that was very instructive and we learned a lot, but it is now my objective to engage with changing the laws and changing the rules. So I've spent a lot of time on our comprehensive plan. I spent a lot of time with our zoning code, sort of spending a lot of time with legislation around transportation. This is why I spend a lot of time on oversight and budget, and why we do endorsements. So we start looking at this stuff kind of the way that everybody else looks at their own issue area, and try to change that. That is, of course, a long-term thing. I think in the future with sort of individual projects, part of this is just acknowledging that like neighborhoods have these interests and they don't necessarily serve a broader interest. Like you can't out-organize that necessarily. You might just have to admit that. And so much of this work, I think, is just admitting what is going on at the time so that you can then sort of move forward and say, okay, like now that we've named the thing, can we start to address it? And you may find then there is not as much tension as you thought, or that there are really a bigger, deeper set of issues that need to be addressed, and that those are probably pretty meaningful and pretty important. I think it's also really important to not make all projects do all things. Like that's just not possible. And I feel like so often when projects become contentious, they become these like vehicles for many, many, many valid sentiments about a lot of other stuff. And it's really just like, that is important and we need to create more spaces for that. But it's also okay to admit that something can't solve all of those problems at once. So some of that is just a lot of like doing cognitive behavioral therapy for any given project? Like seriously, like those are normal questions that like a therapist will walk you through about your own personal life. And like, as much as like I don't love that we should apply that to public work, it is true. So just acknowledging like where people are at, not just meeting people where they are, but being able to say that this is a true experience for people, and just letting that exist and be real in space, so that you can then get that out and move on, is a step that is often missing. Transportation departments aren't supposed to do that. Planning departments, some people expect that they should do that, but they aren't supposed to do that either. So that's something that I think anybody can do in their own neighborhoods.
And wait, just 2 seconds, I promise. To add on a little bit what Alex is saying, it's also okay to let things die. It's also okay to, no, but I'm serious. It is okay from an organizing standpoint. It is okay to let certain things go and let that just disappear into the void. We can let the term YIMBY go. That is something that we can do. We don't have to stick to that term. We could change, we can move. And part of changing and moving, letting go is part of growth, especially for your community, because communities and cities, transit is not supposed to stay the same forever. Cities are given meaning by the people who live in them. And part of the human process, part of the human element, part of being alive, part of being a human is letting things go to make room for something new. So that is also just building off what Alex has said.
That is a perfect conclusion. Thank you so much. I've got one last clerical thing to add. Do not forget the unconference. It's my favorite part of every conference I go to that has an unconference. The deadline for submitting unconference sessions is tonight at midnight. I will look forward to all your great ideas and things to talk about. And you should all figure out your sessions if you haven't already, because we are headed off to the next one. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists and to everybody who came.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
No, honestly, it's okay. I thought it was going to be fine, but then when I saw how many people were unmasked looking back at me, I totally panicked and was like, I cannot take my mask off right now.
That's perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
I would love to connect more since we're doing freeway expansion stuff.
Yes.
Work.
You're welcome. Yes, for sure. Because the more of us that talk, the better. Actually, Ben has a Freeway Fighters Network.
Yes, it is it's a Google. Oh, sorry.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. It was so awesome to hear about what you were working on.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Tires. Drudgery sometimes. But actually, we were just talking about the Freeway Fighters Network. We meet by Zoom monthly.
I haven't. A few heavy street folks have been able to join like inconsistently, but we haven't really been. We've just been so busy with stuff here that we just haven't had time. But we definitely want to make more time.
Yeah, because it's a big issue. I mean, when I started, it was just because I didn't want to live with it. But now it's just totally different and blown up. And there's a lot of support for it. So it's the only way to transform many cities because we can't keep doing it. But I'm glad the housing, transit, transportation is all coming together.
I think it's more of a
Yes, I'm scarred by, get out of here. You don't know what you're doing. From the housing advocate. Come on. You know?
Yeah, no, that's very real.
Yeah, it can't be opportunity for bad affordable housing because that's what she was pushing at all costs. But hi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I will. Yeah. I have some. Yeah.
Hey.
I walked out without my cards. Thank you. Oh. Okay, thank you.